The 5 centuries under discussion were indeed a glorious phase in the history of Buddhism, which spread not only into different areas of the subcontinent, but spread far beyond the subcontinent. Perhaps the most important marker of development of Buddhism in this period was its division into 2 broad types, the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, and the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. According to the Buddhist texts, these 2 broad divisions emerged after the 4th and the last Buddhist council, Sangiti, was held in Kashmir during the time of Kanishka's reign. The Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, and the earlier form of Buddhism had 2 very important sects. One is the Sthaviravadins or Theravadins. Their appearance was seen not only in India, but gradually their messages and pattern of worship spread to Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand. Apart from the Sthaviravadins or Theravadins, another important Hinayana group was Sarvastivadin. The particular group received considerable patronage from Kanishka. The Sarvastivadin idea was that they did not deny the existence of the material world, but at the same time they did not acknowledge the Buddha as a suprahuman being. Close to the ideas of the Sarvastivadins was that of the Mahasanghika, once again another Hinayanist group. The Mahasanghikas upheld the age-old tenets of Theravada Buddhism, that is their steadfast belief in the 4 Arya Satyas, the theory of chain of causation or Pratitya Samutpada, and their following of the Ashtangika Marga or Eightfold Path. But at the same time, they did consider the Buddha as a celestial being. In this development of the Sarvastivadins and the Mahasanghikas, the seeds of the development of the Mahayana form of Buddhism were laid. In Mahayana Buddhism, the most important point was the recognition of the Buddha as a divinity, along with the Bodhisattvas. The Buddha in the making, who is advanced in the way of sadhana, yet he has not become the full enlightened person, and therefore he is the Buddha becoming. The Buddha and the Bodhisattva in Mahayana are considered as worshipable divinities. The most important change that came with the idea of Buddha as a divinity is the worship of the Buddha in human form. Earlier, the Buddha in the Pali canonical text is never considered a divinity, and that's why he was not worshipped in the form of an icon. He was represented only through symbols. Symbols like the Bodhi tree, symbols like the 2 feet of the master, symbol like the elephant, the horse, the lion, all symbolizing the Buddha, and also the turning of the wheel of law, Dharma Chakra Pravartana. It is with the coming of the Mahayana, the idea of Buddha as a great God helped the depiction of the Buddha in the concrete anthropomorphic shape that is in human form. This obviously had a huge appeal in popular life. People obviously found it easier to worship Buddha as an identifiable icon and a divinity instead of the paying of reverence, respect and worship of the Buddha through abstract symbols. Along with that, Mahayana also brought in another important change, the concept of the idea of dana as charity and liberality that leads to great merit, punya. The accruing of merit, therefore, could be a vehicle, ultimately, at least theoretically, ultimately a vehicle for the emancipation of a human being rather than going through the various, or at least the 4 stages of sadhana as laid down in the Pali canonical text. That's why we find the great attraction of Mahayana among the rich, among the powerful, among the elite section of the society who were in a position to make lavish donation in cash and kind to the Buddhist monastery. They had enough resources which they could spend for their charity and liberality to the Buddhist monastery, and therefore they earn merit. Gregory Chopin's fascinating researches on the Buddhist Mahayana text reveals that even the Buddhist monks occasionally entered into trade, they occasionally paid tolls and customs, and they also entered into the credit network. This indicates how Mahayanism helped bringing in the rich, the powerful, the prosperous communities of merchants and artisans into the fold of Buddhism, and the act of patronage helped the spread of Buddhism to far and wide areas. Mahayana Buddhism was the propitiation of Bodhisatva, the Buddha in the making, the Buddha becoming. The Bodhisattva could be an ascetic. He could look like a prince. He could also be a recluse. At the same time, he could also be a householder. We have many images of the Bodhisattva in the Gandhara sculpture, also in the sculpture in Mathura and in the Deccan Amaravati. The Bodhisattva is one who is perfectly capable to attain arhathood, that is Buddhahood, enlightenment. Yet he refrains from doing so because he is full of compassion, karuna. As long as all the beings in the world are capable of raising themselves to the level of emancipation, the Bodhisattva himself refrains from achieving Buddhahood because he is full of compassion at the misery of other people for whom he waits till their miseries are ameliorated. The concept of karuna is very important in the development of the worship of the Bodhisattva. The 3 prominent Bodhisattvas are, one is Avalokiteshvara, who actually looks at the miseries of the people, who listens to the miseries of the people. He is full of compassion. There is Manjusri, who presides over knowledge and removes the evil of darkness. He is the preceptor of the future Buddha, Maitreya. So this is the world of the Bodhisattvas, and there was an enormous appeal because of the Sarvastivadin growth of Sarvastivadin sect. Buddhism began to spread during the Kushana period into Afghanistan, Afghanistan to Central Asia, Central Asia to China. And because of the proselytizing zeal of the Buddhist monks, it had already begun spreading to Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, in those distant areas. It truly became an international, at least an Asian, one of the major Asian religions. If Buddhism was making its presence felt in a very major way, Jainism did not lag behind, though the Jainas did not become as zealous as the Buddhists to spread their faith beyond the subcontinent, but they are very prominent in the subcontinent. The two divisions among the Jainas, the Digambaras, who generally remain naked because they consider they are sky clad, Digambara, and the Shvetambaras, who are clad in white garments. This division, the two major sects in Jainism, is complete by this time. There were a number of major Jaina centers. The Jaina centers, prominent among them were Ujjaini. Mathura was center of Jainism. Punravardhana area, that is the northern part of Bengal. One of the very prominent Jaina devotee was King Kharavela, through whom Jainism possibly penetrates into Kalinga area. The religious beliefs, practices were inseparably associated with the visual arts, both in the realm of sculpture and in architecture. Sculptures were made to depict mostly divine images, and architecture, though some secular architecture are not unknown in the form of some palaces, dwelling houses, large scale urban structures, fortifications, moat, etc. These are secular architecture, but most of the architectural remains are related to religious shrines. Let us now look at that. First, at architecture. The two most important aspects of architecture between 200 BC and about AD 300 are the construction of stupas and chaityas, both having very close relationship with Buddhism. The stupa stands for a mound. Originally, it stood for an earthen mound. The earthen mound possibly acted as a tradition in funerary practice. In fact, the Buddha suggested to Ananda in the very last days of his life that a stupa should be built over the last mortal remains of the master after he passes away. Now, there are three types of stupas. One in which the corporeal relics of the master were interred. There are some other stupas which are associated with great disciples of the Buddha, and there are some commemorative stupas. Now, earlier, the stupas must have been made of earthen mounds. Later, the stupas became more durable and permanent when brick encasings were put on top of it to make it more durable and permanent. Ashoka, in Buddhist tales and legends, is credited with the construction of 84,000 stupas. The most representative example of the stupa architecture is the famous stupa at Sanchi in Madhya Pradesh. The stupa's most remarkable feature is the hemispherical dome, a semicircular dome, which usually stands on a single platform or a couple of platforms. On the top of the stupa stands a box-like member called harmika, over which was erected a number of parasols, an umbrella-like object called chhatra and chhatradanda. At Sanchi, the stupas stand there and encircled with stone railing pillars, and there are superbly decorated gateways at the entrance of the stupas. The stupa generally is completely bare, and the richly carved gateways and railing pillars offer a very aesthetic contrast. We have another architecture very closely associated with Buddhism, Chaityas. The Chaitya actually stands for rock cut architecture. It stands usually for the artificial caves which were dug out, hewn out of live rocks. The inside of the Chaitya is usually blank, consisting of a long rectangular hall, sometimes with a rounded end, that's why called apsidal back structure. It has a number of pillars from the beginning of the hall to the end of the hall, and the superstructure of the Chaitya consists of barrel vaulted roof. The entire construction was very much influenced by similar structures in wood. So the translation of the carpenter's work, the craft of the carpenter, was later translated onto stone. If the interior of the Chaitya hall, it's essentially meant for assembly of the monks and the devotees, is relatively bare, less decorated. One of the principal features of the Chaitya architecture is its gabaksha, or a window at the facade of the Chaitya. The horseshoe shaped Chaitya window is the main source of light through which the sunlight gets into the interior of the Chaitya. Usually the facade is wonderfully decorated. Prime examples of such Chaityas or rock cut architecture in this period come from Western Deccan. If one travels between Bombay and Mumbai and Pune, one can see caves like Kanheri, Bhaja, Karla, Junnar, Nasik, Kondane. This is a remarkable tradition we see here. The stupa, like Chaityas, were widely spreading in different parts of India. The Chaitya is obviously seen where you have mountain ranges and rocks which could be excavated for the staying of the monks and Buddhist devotees. Three major schools of sculpture, stone sculpture, came up during this period. We have already said that the Maurya period brought for the first time the regular use of stone as a medium of sculpture. That tradition continues in this period, but the character of the Mauryan art as a court art is completely negated. It is given up. If we look at the sculptures at Sanchi, Bharut, Bodh Gaya, also in certain areas of Gandhara, we do not find that the court is dictated by the taste and will of the court, but the scenes essentially depict the endless flow of life of human beings, life in urban areas, life in villages, the world of flora, fauna, the popular tales, legends, which are often unfurled before the onlooker, like the scroll painter opens up the Patachitra. Particularly this is seen in the carving of the gateways at Sanchi. They often represent the scroll, the unfurling scroll, and that's why Niharanjan Rai pointed out that the art of the narrative art at Sanchi, Bharut, at these places often resembled the translation onto the stone what is called the Patachitra, the art of the scroll painters or scroll makers, which obviously brings art very close to daily life. The Buddha and the Bodhisattvas could be shown now in human form instead of aniconic symbols. So there are numerous representations showing the different major aspects of the master, from his birth to his parinirvana, in the middle of which the master's leaving Kapilavastu, the master attaining Bodhi, the master preaching at Sarnath. If one looks at the Gandhara sculptures, we will find the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas with their oval face, very sharp nose, wonderfully chiseled portrayal, the wearing of Roman type of sandals, the use of heavy drapery in their clothes often resemble the Roman Apollo. Since Gandhara was at the crossroad, the northwestern frontier, and imbued with many non-Indian traits, Hellenistic traits of sculpture did percolate in. Once scholars like Vincent Smith, Albert Fouché considered that it is because of the Greco-Roman tradition of naturalistic representation of human bodies that led to the creation of the super figures, and they indicated that ancient Indian artists were normally incapable of portraying the human figure in proper anatomical details and with the aesthetic pleasure. This was countered effectively earlier by Stella Kramrisch and Ananda Kumaraswamy, who indicated though there were indeed many non-Indian traits, particularly Hellenistic traits, in the depiction of the Buddha figure, the theme is essentially Indian, very Indian. All the themes are Indian. And Kumaraswamy pointed out that even the depiction of the Buddha in the human form could have been inspired by the depiction of the Yaksha figures in North India, which was already well in vogue. In Gandhara, the medium of sculptures are essentially schist, black schist, grey schist, and later stucco. In Mathura, we have stone but of a different style, the red spotted stone. In Mathura, apart from the numerous images of Buddha, Bodhisattva, Jaina figures of Brahmanical divinities, we also have figures of large figures, massive figures of yakshas, wide-eyed, with a very earthly smile, muscular figure with a pot-bellied appearance, and very mundane in character. Similarly, we find figures of women with all charms of youth, beauty, and very expressive sense of sensuousness. Particularly if one looks at the bracket figure of the thinly attired woman figure at Sanchi, or the scenes of women having a bath, tying their hair on the balcony of a house, the scenes of drinking, bacchanalian scenes, very clearly indicates the enjoyment of mundane life rather than the mere celebration of spirituality. This is happening in the case of Mathuran art. The wonderful figure of the Buddha, the seated Buddha with one hand raised in Abhaya Mudra, the gesture of assurance, one shoulder covered by the wrapper, the other shoulder left bare. The Buddha is firmly seated, yet he is with open eyes and with a smiling face. This is the famous Katara Buddha from Mathura area. In the very famous school of sculpture around Amaravati, Jagayapeta, the area of Dhanyakataka or Dharanikota area, the Nagarjuna Konda, the area which was dominated politically by the Ikshwakus, we find there similar stories of the life of the Buddha, and many other scenes connected with Buddhism, but depicted in a distinct style. There we find in the Amaravati school of sculpture, the sculpture panel is packed with figures in action. Usually all the human figures are shown in vibrant actions. Therefore, often the figures in the Amaravati school of sculpture are shown with long limbs, elongated shapes that highlights the character of the linear rhythm in the sculpture. While in Mathura, and in Gandhara, linear rhythm is maintained, but at the same time many of the figures are imbued with a wonderful treatment of the roundness of form, the plasticity of form, the soft, tender flowing of the flesh can be almost felt in those sculptures. In the period under review, we find two major traits of Indian sculpture: the love for a rounded form, whether a male form or a female form, and the flowing contour of the outline of the figure are both maintained in a harmonious manner. We have given a very rapid survey of the cultural life. If we have to sum up these 500 years, how do we see it? In the 1950s, 60s, or even slightly early 1940s, many historians considered this period as a time which did not see a paramount power. So it was seen also as a time when many non-Indian political powers invaded India and ruled India. It was seen kind of a dark age, a vacuum, a period of crisis. We have already seen in our survey that in spite of the absence of a demise of a paramount political power and the arrival of many non-Indian political powers, it did not spell any catastrophe, a doom in Indian way of life. Of course, invasions took place, but this is a period where economic life, the spread of agriculture, the spread of trade, urban centers did take place, and the widespread contacts not only were relevant in commercial life, they had very major and significant impacts on cultural life. This is a period where we have seen enough creative activities, both in literature and in visual arts, came up. This is one of the most formative phases in Indian history, and it possibly laid the foundation of the cultural efflorescence that took place in the subsequent phase, that is from 300 AD to 600 AD.